you do if you're you have too high an inflation rate? So let's say whatever this inflation rate is too high. We don't like it. What do you want to do? Well, one thing you can do is reduce the growth of aggregate demand down to a different, lower inflation rate. The worry is the growth rate slows and maybe you have a rise in unemployment. It's sort of what we're going through now. But we're talking about monetary policy here, so how do you do this? How do we do this? Well, we've got this, and so what can the Fed do? Well, the Fed can change the discount rate, can change the required reserve ratio, but we're not going to make much of that. I'm not even going to write it on the board. Why? Because none of you stopped your car by driving it into the side of the building today, right? Right? It's a crude way to do it. It's just not used. It's been used once. I'm 1,000,000 years old and it's been used once in my lifetime. But there are two other things you can do. You can use open market operations and slow the buying of bonds. Right? Buy fewer bonds on the open market. Who does this? Who can control this? The Federal Open Market Committee, right? You buy fewer bonds, and then aggregate demand is lower. The growth in aggregate demand over time is slower. So that's one thing you can do. So you can do open market operations. The other thing you can do is raise the discount rate. The idea of who does that? Who raises the discount rate? The Board of Governors of the Fed. If you raise the discount rate, banks more slowly borrow from the Fed, meaning the amount of monetary base in the economy slows. The growth of it slows, meaning aggregate demand slows. So both of these are, and ideally it'd be raise the discount rate above the federal funds rate. Both of these are contractionary policy. The Fed is trying to slow things down. But what they're trying to get at is aggregate demand. They're trying to get at aggregate demand. Alternatively, if aggregate demand 1 is down here, the growth rate is a lot lower than it could be, and inflation is low, then what you want to do is increase aggregate demand. So you would do the opposite. You'd buy more bonds on the open market, you'd lower the discount rate. But what if we're in a nice place like this? Well, make it more like a nice place like this. We've got a pretty low inflation rate. We've got a growth rate pretty close to the optimum growth rate. And then we get an aggregate supply shock. So that all of a sudden we have unemployment, all of a sudden inflation is higher. What do? Well, I guess you could increase aggregate demand trying to get the growth rate up, but what happens when you increase aggregate demand? Trying to get the growth rate up. Well, the growth rate goes up some, which is what you want, but you get higher inflation. People are unhappy. Well, alternatively, you could say, all right, well, we're here, we don't like this, the inflation is up, so I'll reduce aggregate demand, keep the inflation at pi 1, but then you get even lower growth, higher unemployment. So basically, if you get an aggregate supply shock, what does that mean? I guess we could say you're screwed. You're going to lose the next election. You know, something like that. So, and I guess the last case, just to finish this off and to make it fit, what if our situation is what if we're like here, we've got a good growth rate. Let's say that inflation rate's okay by us. Then we get a aggregate supply increase. Mass marketing of personal computers. The opening of the West so that anybody that wanted to go out west and could homestead, at least you can still do that in Alaska, but it's a little tougher than going to Iowa. Well, so you get here, you get growth of 2, but your inflation rate becomes lower. Maybe it even becomes negative in the 1880s, etc. It did become negative. And if you just increase aggregate demand to support the growth, you can have even a higher growth rate. So in this case, you're screwed. In this case, you need aggregate demand growth to support the supply increase, the aggregate supply increase. This is where you want to be. This is where you don't want to be. And more often it's this demand thing where, okay, demand has gotten too high, we've got inflation, you got to bring it down and try to bring it down but not cause a recession. Or demand is too low, the 1930s, right? Maybe even just COVID stuff, right? What's going to happen when a third of the banks in the United States close? You're going to get your money out of the bank. Not to spend, but you're going to just get your money out of the bank so that you don't lose it. Or during COVID, what are you going to do? You don't know if your job's going to exist next week, so you don't spend what you have. You didn't take it out of the banks, but the bank, but other than buying toilet paper to hoard, you're real cautious about going out and spending money. All right, so that's monetary policy. There's 2 ways to have monetary policy. say the central bank must react in certain ways. And the targets can be interest rates, gold standard, money, or exchange rates, among others, and even combinations. Basically, it says you want to have the money stock grow at a constant rate. Or it says if the dollar starts depreciating, you have to reduce the number of dollars you're putting in the economy to make it appreciate, to make its value go back up. Or if the interest rate is too high, if interest rates start spiking up, you put more money in the economy to make borrowing cheaper. That's what these rules say. Or you can have discretion. The central bank does what it thinks is best. Both of these have problems. Both rules and discretions have problems. One thing, there's something called the political business cycle. So we look at our inflation. And it basically, inflation over time, it says that we observe a little thing like this, where it seems that central banks sort of before elections spike up inflation, spike up the amount of money in the economy, trying to make you happy, particularly those of you who suffer from money illusion, so that you'll vote back in the people that appointed them. So the powers that be go back in. And really the interesting thing, what is E1, E2, E3, do you suspect? Elections. No, just elections. And notice, they do the lowering inflation after the election. They are willing to inflate the economy. And the irony of this is there are basically two types of representative government systems in the world. There's the U.S. system, which I don't guess really has a name. I mean, it has federalism, but that doesn't have anything to do with this. And then there's the parliamentary system. How is the parliamentary system different than the U.S. system?
Well, I know in England they can call for an election.
Our elections are fixed in time.
Yeah, if they don't like what's going on in the economy, they call for an election. That's how is it treason?
No, if they like what's going on in the economy, they call an election. Because the person that can call the election is the party that's in power. But it just so basically ours are fixed in time. Theirs are fixed, every 5 years they have to have one, or every 6. It depends on Israel. Well, England and Israel, it's different from country. There are a lot of parliamentary systems. But it seems we get the same pattern, whether the elections are fixed in time, right? Ours are fixed in time, it could be a coincidence.
That's like the English had the one prime minister the month that the Queen died for a month.
Right, but
That's what they gotta know.
but they didn't have new elections, all
Yeah.
that was the party changing. But basically what's happening is that we see this pattern whether the elections are fixed in time or not, which indicates it's causal, that the central bank is doing this because of it. Now, alternatively, okay, you say, okay, well, look, these guys are sort of politicians. I don't trust these damn politicians anyway, let's tie their hands with rules. So let's say you adopt an exchange rate rule. So we're gonna make our exchange rate match somebody else's exchange rate. So essentially what it says is you gotta put enough money out there so that your exchange rate stays the same with somebody else. Well, that works fine maybe fine if your major trading partners are Japan and Switzerland, who have really low inflation rates. But what if your major trading partners are Brazil, Russia, South Africa, who have really high inflation rates? You're gonna have to keep your money's relative value to that other country, you're gonna have to inflate as much as them. So the rule might not work for you. Or at least that rule may not. And any of these rules potentially have problems, so I can't tell you which way to go. You yourself have to say, would I rather have a rule? It's sort of like your mom and you. If you wanted to other than Sunday school I went to growing up, but that's another story. If you wanted to model your behavior after the kids you go to Sunday school with, mom's probably happy with that, right? If you want to model your behavior with your crazy cousins, after your crazy cousins, what's true? Mom doesn't like that. So it depends on what rule you establish, how you lock yourself down. So, and the last part of this is lags in monetary policy. And there are 4 lags. One we've discussed a bunch. It's called the recognition lag. How long does it take to recognize that we're in a recession or that we're in an inflation? Well, maybe you could take the unemployment data. Maybe that can tell you in a couple of months. But to get 2 measures of GDP growth, it takes 6 months, right? We're back to that problem that I started discussing at the beginning of the data, that we don't measure GDP every month. There are some measures that get at it, but they're not, we don't get a good GDP measure every month. We get an inflation measure every month, but, you gotta be careful. You don't want to be whipsawing economic policy back and forth. But so it's gonna take us, maybe 6 months to 9 months to recognize what's happening in the economy. Okay, once you recognize what's happening in the economy, what do you gotta do? You got to decide. So there's a decision lag. Now the news is pretty good here. How long does it take the Fed to decide to raise the discount rate or lower the discount rate or increase the monetary base, decrease the monetary base? It's pretty quick. Maybe 1 week. Right? The Fed just goes out and does it. They get together, meet, the Federal Open Market Committee, the Board of Governors meet, they decide what they want to do. So once they decide what they want to do, what do they got to do? Huh? What do they have to do once they decide what they want to do? Hmm? Yeah, you decided you want to date with somebody, well, you actually have to go on the date, right? So, there's an action lag, or an implementation, to use a fancier word. And, right, the Fed says, let's buy more bonds. The Federal Open Market Committee buys more bonds. The Fed says, let's raise the discount rate. They call up on the phone and tell all the 12 reserve banks the discount rate is now 2.25% rather than 2%, or whatever it currently is. So this is a one-day thing. And then, what's the last part? How long does it take to affect the economy? So the effect lag. And it's maybe 6 months to 9 months to infinity months. It's a long time. These policies take a long time to work their way through the economy. You know, some of this inflation we're having is unexpectedly high, even though they think they're trying to stop it, because all the money they dumped in the economy during COVID is still working its way through the economy. It takes a long time to do that. So, we know what monetary policy is. We know that if inflation is too high due to a demand shock, we want to restrict demand. We know if it's due to a supply shock, I mean, what are we going to do, right? Maybe just accept the higher inflation, try to reduce the amount of the slowing of growth, or trying to reduce the unemployment associated with it. Trying to speed back up growth, but that's basically what we have. We're sort of stuck. If aggregate demand is too little, then maybe you need to pump up the monetary base, pump up the growth of aggregate demand. We're trying to get at aggregate demand. Now, so the other thing that we can talk about is, we'll go back to your notes on the things that affect aggregate demand. So go back to your notes on aggregate demand. What types of things affect aggregate demand? Did I say that was chapter 16, monetary policy? I should have said chapter 16. So what other things can affect aggregate demand? We said monetary policy, because our aggregate demand came from the quantity equation. Confidence in the economy. Does the government have a magic confidence wand? Can they make you more confident? No. Right? The government maybe can scare you into putting on a mask due to COVID. When they decide it's over, does everybody take off the mask? Right? For years and decades, you'd see it was a polite thing to do in Asia, in Japan and China. You'd see people on the subways with masks on. If they were sick, that was the polite thing to do. We still see some, nobody in here, but we still see people with masks on when we're out. How many people have seen somebody over the weekend, saw somebody wearing a mask? Yeah. So the government doesn't have a magic wand to change how you feel. Sometimes they try to scare you and it fails completely. Sometimes they try to change your view and it fails. So, not confidence. What else is on that list besides confidence? Health.
Well,
Wealth.
Fear of losing job, or that.
Yeah, all those things, but what is on there that the government can affect?
Tax growth.
The growth of taxes and the growth of government spending. This is what's called fiscal policy. So that's why we're gonna ignore all those others, right? We've already done monetary policy, we're turning to fiscal policy today, and it won't take us very long.
What chapter is this one?
Chapter 17. The last one was 16. We're gonna do 16, 17, and 18 today. All right. I don't know, let's do the verbiage of this first, and then we'll do the, So to spend money or increases in G must be financed by what? How can the government get money to spend?
Taxes.
They can stick a gun in your face and take it. That is called taxes. What else can they do? How else can they get it?
Import taxes,
That's called taxes.
tariffs.
That's called taxes. They can get you to voluntarily give it to them. Under what circumstances would you voluntarily give the government your money?
Social Security.
That's called taxes. There's a gun behind that. And what? Huh? Well, maybe war, but probably not. Hmm? Fundraisers, maybe. Government's not very sympathetic, though.
Student loans, the interest they get off that.
No, the government can borrow it from you. Why do you voluntarily give the money when the government borrows it from you? Because they promise to give you the money back and pay you interest. So the government can borrow the money from you. And what's the third way they can do it? They can just print the money. Now, that's basically the three ways the government can get money. And just like you, to spend money, what must the government do? What do you have to do to spend money?
Hopefully have a budget.
No?
Thank you.
Yeah, you have to get some someplace. You gotta get some money someplace. Same thing is true of the government. The only way they can spend money is if they get it. Now, they can send the army out to commandeer your house. You know, they can take things from you. But to spend money, they actually have to give the money or get the money somehow. There's only three ways. You know, I guess I'm sort of subsuming into taxes, because there is a gun behind this too. Your payment into Yellowstone National Park, or you're paying for your driver's license, etc. The government, does collecting fees, but they're really taxes.
Speeding tickets.
Speeding tickets, yeah, that's a tax. Tax for driving faster than the government feels is safe. Well, really, should be than your neighbors feel is safe. So, that's the verbiage of it, it's very easy to put in. Put it in the form of the government's budget constraint. So we can say G plus V equals the sources, the taxes, plus the additions to bonds, plus the addition to money. So G is government spending. V is transfer payments. We might or might not separate them out. We do separate them out. I think in this book they separate them out. You don't always have to separate them out. They are philosophically different when you're trying to talk about economic policy. If the government buys up a resource, what's true? The government buys a good. The government buys a computer. A, the private sector can't use it, but B, the computer had to be produced, right? The computer is part of GDP. A transfer payment, the government, there's nothing purchased, right? The government gives you, if the government purchases me, then they take up my time, right? Just like any other worker. If the government sends me, adopts my policy on monetary policy, and starts sending the increase in the money supply to my bank account each month or each week, right? I get lots of money, but I don't have to do anything. I can still work here, or I can stop working if I want. So, you know, this involves part of GDP, this doesn't. And people get offended by this sometimes. Social Security, what's true? It's a transfer payment. Doesn't involve any GDP in this period. It involves what you've worked in the past, but that doesn't really affect GDP now, right? What we care about is, we don't care, well, the economy was really strong 10 years ago. What matters is what's happening in the economy now. Because when you're old and retired, can you consume any of the goods that you produce? We're working. No, you gotta consume goods that people are making now with your Social Security. All right, so we've got that. T is taxes. And notice this is tax receipts for the government. This is very different than the tax rate that we talked about with aggregate supply. This is how much of your money, right? The tax rate doesn't affect how much you can spend. It might affect how much you do spend or how much you work. That's really our concern with it, is it affects how much you work. But the amount of taxes, if the government takes $10 from you, what's true about that $10? You can't spend it, right? They got it, you can't spend it. Whereas if the government raises the marginal tax rate from 20% to 22%, only to the extent that it takes more money or less money from you, does it affect your spending. So this is just the pure dollars the government takes. Whereas the thing that affects aggregate supply is the tax rate, because if the tax rate is high enough, you won't work, right? At 100% tax rate, if the government took all the money you made working, what would happen to your work? Probably even you nurses who claim to be compassionate, care about other people. Probably you're not working, right? At least you're not working for the jerk you're working for now, right? Right, that's part of the problem with work is you have a boss. All right. B is bonds. So if the bonds today and the bonds bonds, next period. Well, the difference is what? How much the government borrowed. Right? If you have $10,000 in student loans, and you go out and buy a new BMW X3 for $50,000, what's going to be true about your debt? Goes up to $60,000. Well, it depends on how much you put down on the car. But right, that just tells you the difference between what you owe today. A bond is just what you owe, and what you owe next period is what you borrow in the meantime. And the same thing is true of M is money, and M1 minus M0 is money created during the period. Maybe I should say money printed during the period. So, the top 1% in the U.S. pays what percentage of the U.S. income tax? Anybody know? This is just sort of an aside. The top 1% pays 45.8% are paid in the most recent 2021, the most recent year of data. Paid 45.8% of federal income taxes. Top 10% paid a little over 3/4 of the income taxes. Pretty remarkable. I think almost 50% of people don't pay federal income taxes. But of course they do pay FICA taxes. But it depends if you agree with them that FICA taxes aren't really a tax because you're saving it and getting the money back later if you live long enough. Yeah. You can look at it that way. Economists don't very often. So, that's the government budget constraint. We can see then that I guess I should say this, government debt. What is the government debt? What's the government owe? Bonds. However much the bonds are, whatever period you're in. That's what the government owes. Right? Just like you owe the total of your student debt, which could be zero, plus the total of whatever's the outstanding balance on your car, could be zero. Total outstanding balance on your house, which might be zero if you rent, could be zero if you own your house outright, if you're don't have. But your debt is always what you owe, and bonds are what the government owes. The deficit government deficit is what? G plus V minus taxes, which equals B1 minus B0 plus M1 minus M0. I'm not going to try to catch you on this. It's sort of controversial whether you just zero this out. If you have a dollar bill in your pocket, what does that say? The government owes you what? Another dollar bill, right? It has the full faith and credit of the United States behind it. So you could argue whether that's really part of the deficit or not, but I mean, in some technical economic sense it is. I'm not gonna try to trick you on that on the test, but the change in bonds is certainly the debt, right? Certainly the deficit, right? That's how much additional debt the government has accumulated. It's a matter of whether you believe money is a debt of government or not. And it, traditionally it was because why? Because the government had to give you gold or silver if you brought in their money. We're gonna have to give you anything now, so it's not really a debt in the same sense. All right. And last but not least, let's talk about fiscal policy. So another of those strange English word things, right? Fiscal policy is not physical policy. Fiscal policy speaks of government influence, government policy. The idea is G growth, government spending growth, increases our dynamic aggregate demand. But what's the problem here? I guess I should have said this in the last chapter. What's the problem here? To get the money, what does the government have to do?
Borrow it or borrow it.
They either have to take it from you with a gun, in which case their spending goes up, your spending goes down. Maybe there's still a small increase in the economy because the government spends 100% of the money. You might not spend 100% of your money. As a college student, you probably do. But later in life, you save some for the future. You save some in case you get old enough to retire. But even that, you put it someplace and it's given to, loaned to a corporation who buys it, who spends it. So your money, if the government taxes the money, probably there's going to be very little effect. If the government borrows the money, what's true? Well, ultimately, in the long run, what's true about your borrowing in the long run? What can you borrow in the long run? Essentially zero. Because you got to pay it all back. The government's the same way. If the government borrows today, they've got to raise taxes in the future. So, and tax growth reduces aggregate demand. Now, the fiscal theory is, and maybe this is somewhat true in a depression, resources are not being used. They're empty factories. Unemployed workers. Government spending can put them back to work. By creating aggregate demand. So that's again the theory of what's going on. But there are a lot of ways it may not work. For a lot of reasons it may not work. If the government runs a $1 debt today, if the government runs a $330 million debt today and borrows, then on average you divide 330 million people into $330 million, what do we all owe in the future? $1. $1 plus the interest on that dollar. So, future taxes have to be raised. Right, if you've got this future tax, you got to save, and in some sense this is a tautology, right? Because the government runs $330 million worth of debt today. It's $1 for each of us. How do they run this debt? By selling $330 million worth of bonds. Well, the people who own the bonds are in fact saving $330 million. Any effect may be small. Because, the idea is, okay, you get $10, you spend it at the store pays it to the workers spend it at another store, and you get this big multiple effect of the money. But the problem is, get the money, the government either had to take money from you, which contracts your spending, borrow it from you, which contracts your spending, or print it. But if they print it, then we're just talking monetary policy, right? That's, I said I should have said this earlier, and I never got around to saying it again. Right? If we get to the point where we're saying, well, the government can print the money, well, that's just monetary policy. Right? That's not fiscal policy. It's just monetary policy. And of course, it can be mistimed. I don't know, are they still working on I-10 between here and Mississippi? Anybody drive that every day? Are they still working on it? My suspicion is that might still be Obama-era stimulus money at work. So that's what they're doing still. And there is this analogy, they also use this analogy with monetary policy, and there's a reason to have rules with monetary policy. It's called the fool in the shower analogy. Maybe it would be better to call it the person in the hotel room shower. Right? You get in the shower, you turn it on, and what's true? You're either freezing or being scalded. You make a small adjustment and what happens? You're either the reverse, right? Your scalding water turns to freezing water. Right? How many people have been in a hotel room where you suffered greatly trying to figure out how the hell to get the water on sort of a medium temperature, right? Anybody had to jump out of the shower ever because it was so hot? I think I have. I've been in a number of hotel rooms in my life. But, yeah, so, you know, that you turn it all one way, then turn it the other way, and you're always mistiming in what you need to do.
Or you could be in Europe trying to wash your hands back and forth.
England, I don't know all of Europe's like that, but anyway, yeah. In England, they have
Cold and hot.
a spigot for hot, a spigot for cold, and they don't mix them. So it's very weird. All right, but this takes us also to our last topic. What's the one thing we need to talk about that we haven't talked about with fiscal policy? Look at monetary policy. What did we talk about with monetary policy?
The lags.
Yeah, the lags. We got to talk about the lags. And the lags are the part of why it can be mistimed. Okay, what's the recognition lag? It should be real simple. What's the recognition lag? How long is the recognition lag?
6 to 9 months.
It better be 6 to 9 months. Why? Same economy, same data. It doesn't matter whether you're doing fiscal policy or monetary policy. Whatever it is, if you think 6 to 9 months, he's full of it, I don't believe that. Doesn't matter. It's the same for fiscal policy and monetary policy. What about the decision lag?
Still, was that a week?
Hmm?
Was it a week?
Well, it's a week for monetary policy. How long is it for fiscal policy? Who's making the decision?
The government, so it's gonna take longer than a week.
Yeah, no, actually not the government. Not the way we use that term. Congress.
That's gonna take forever.
So, President Obama was probably pretty happy that he got Obamacare, although it wasn't what he wanted. Why? Because government involvement, probably single payer health care, has been in the Democrat Party platform since at least the 1930s. That's how long that decision took. And even I wasn't alive in the 1930s. So, it can take, I don't know. And of course, famously Roosevelt, famously President Obama, when there were crises, sometimes Congress acts, during COVID, Congress acts, but, 3 months, maybe the famous 100 days of Roosevelt, to essentially forever. And of course, what happens? After they finally make a decision, what do you have to do? Implement, if you want to sound technical. Or act, if you want to sound more human. All right, what happens? What did President Obama famously say after the stimulus years later? These shovel-ready jobs weren't as shovel-ready as he thought. All right, let's say we're going to build a road. That's a famous project. Or build a bridge. what's the first thing that happens? You know, we've already had, okay, in Congress, why does it take 3 months? We have to have hearings, we have to have, both houses have to pass it, it then goes to a conference committee, and they have to come out with something, and then the whole Congress passes, and then the president has to sign it. So, now we're gonna implement this law that's been passed, taken 10 years, 5 years, whatever, 3 months in the case of the stimulus. And what happens? Well, first of all, a guy with a sextant and another guy with a stick go out and lay out the path, right? So that's not exactly stimulating the economy very much. And as that's happening, what's happening? All the interest groups are suing and saying the environmental impact statement wasn't done properly, or et cetera, et cetera. It takes a long time to act. So, I don't know, 6 months to infinity months, which gets us down to the fool in the shower, or the traveler in the hotel shower, if you want to be more polite. Analogy, right? Takes a long, long time to act. That's why I'm suspicious this is still stimulus money being spent. Almost 16 years later. Maybe it's not. I mean, I can't, you'd have to investigate it, but that money took a long, long time to. And, they sort of did it on they did it a little bit smart. They didn't build a lot of new roads. What did they do? Resurface roads that already existed, which is in some ways a way to get some of this money out the door.
Bridge to Nowhere, was that part of that package?
I don't know where the bridge, there are several bridges to
Isn't that,
nowhere.
I think it's Alaska?
There's one in Argentina too, so that certainly wasn't part of it, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I think that's much older. I think the one in Alaska is much older than this stuff. I think I heard of it before Obama was president. But it takes a long time for the federal government to act. If you wanted to criticize the U.S. Constitution with its checks and balances, et cetera, it's a government that's designed not to act quickly. Because governments that, act quickly oftentimes degenerate into genocide and things. All right, so finally, the effectiveness lag. It's sort of the same thing. Okay, the money gets put out there and somebody has to spend it, it's spent by somebody else. You pay these guys to retar a road, they get the money, they go spend it on they go to the ABC store and spend it on alcohol, and it goes to somebody else, and the ABC store pays its people, and they go to the grocery store, and the grocery store pays its people. It takes a while to work through the economy, so it's going to be 6 months to, I don't know, a long time. Again, the effects, just like the effects of monetary policy can be long-lasting, so can the effects of fiscal policy. But what's the upshot here? What do we know for sure here? Well, the recognition and the effect lags are about the same. They're sort of outside of our discussion, but the decision and action lags with monetary policy are much more reasonable. And additionally, I don't know whether this is maybe this is a mistimed thing too. Look, and I said this, I think, earlier, if the Fed needs to increase the rate of money growth, they can. If the Fed needs to decrease the rate of money growth, they can, and they can have the will to. If Congress needs to increase the growth of government spending, they're happy to do that, right? They're happy to spend more money Because what are they trying to do when they spend money? Buy your vote. Right, they're trying to reproduce themselves. Re-elect the incumbents. We gave you all this money. So Congress is happy to spend money, but what if the economy's in such a situation like maybe it is now, we need to slow the growth of money. It's of government spending, slow the growth of government spending, maybe even reduce it. Congress is not good at that at all. They aren't happy about that in the least bit. So that's another way, that's another mistiming thing that, basically, and this is not my opinion, this is on a practical sense, economic policy is run through monetary policy now because government, it's not nimble enough and it's not flexible enough. It's not nimble enough in that it takes far longer than fiscal policy. It's not nimble enough because it's asymmetric. Fiscal policy is great if you want to spend more. You're just not going to get legislation. It's not the U.S. Congress, right? We know about the U.S. Congress, but guess what? People complain about legislatures around the world having the same problems. All right, so you have a good idea about fiscal monetary policy. We will go over the practice test I sent you. A week from today, we will have the last test. A week from Thursday, we'll get it back. And then sometime the next week is the final. Hard to believe, isn't it?